All right, let's dive into something really fascinating today. India's educational heritage. We've got a ton of cool videos and articles ready to go, and honestly, this is going to be way more exciting than any history class I ever took. We're going to journey back in time to ancient schools, see how empires and wars changed things, and uncover how the British left their mark on the system.
What's really captivating is how crazy advanced India's ancient learning system was.
Right, like way beyond memorization.
Oh, yeah, it was all about critical thinking, heated debates, and a blend of religion, science, practical stuff, all in one.
Imagine students traveling from, like, China, Korea, Indonesia, risking everything to get a degree from an Indian university.
Crazy, right?
Places like Nalanda and Takshashila, those are the big leagues back then. Globally famous knowledge centers.
And these universities, they had standards that make today's top schools nervous.
Seriously.
Nalanda, for instance, 80% rejection rate on their entrance exam.
80%. Those students must have been freaking out.
You think? It's kind of wild. They even had coaching centers back then, just like our test prep industry today. But it wasn't all cutthroat. The sources show a lot of collaboration, too. Professors moving between different universities, sharing what they knew, helping everyone out.
Yeah, that's so cool, like spreading the knowledge around.
Exactly. Take Thirumalai and Gunamati, they were legends, started Vallabhi University, and then brought their expertise to Nalanda. We could definitely use more of that kind of knowledge sharing today.
For sure. And we can't forget about the Gurukul system. Living with your guru, learning not just from books, but through actual experience.
Yeah.
Philosophy 1 minute, cooking the next, then stitching. Like, it was a complete education, you know?
Totally holistic, really focused on individual learning, too. There's this video with Pete Satish Sharma. He talks about Varna in a really interesting way.
Varna, like the caste system.
Yeah, but he says it wasn't about a rigid hierarchy. It was about figuring out what you're good at and tailoring education to fit your strengths. It makes you think about our own aptitude tests and learning paths today, doesn't it?
Yeah. That's pretty deep. And another thing that jumped out at me was how obsessed ancient Indians were with logic and debate. These guys were serious about their arguments.
No kidding. They had terms for every part of an argument, like sad, siddhanta, hetu. And they even had rules for, like, deducting points during a debate. Talk about taking critical thinking seriously.
Right, but all this intellectual energy wasn't confined to India. Indian scholars were traveling all over, spreading knowledge, influencing cultures way beyond their borders.
Absolutely. It's mind-blowing when you see the examples. Dharmaruchi, he spent 20 years in China translating 53 Sanskrit works.
Wow, 53. That's commitment.
And then there's Kumarajiva, his translation of the Diamond Sutra. It's like a pillar of Chinese literature.
Incredible. I love how these ideas just traveled and took root in different places.
And don't forget, Gautama Siddha.
Who's that?
This guy, he headed China's Board of Astronomy and introduced Indian numerals to them. So, like, Indian knowledge was shaping Chinese science.
Wow, that's amazing. It's like these threads of knowledge connecting everything. And it went west, too, right?
Oh, yeah, big time. Rishi Canada, his ideas on atoms, they seem to have influenced Democritus in ancient Greece.
Democritus, the atom guy.
Yep. And you know who his student was? Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine. It's like this intellectual family tree.
Whoa. Talk about an impressive lineage. It's truly amazing how these ancient ideas traveled and changed the world.
But, you know, this golden age of learning, it couldn't last forever. There were dark times ahead.
Yeah, the invasions. It's kind of sad to know what's coming next. The Islamic invasions starting in the 11th century, they were brutal, especially for places like Nalanda, Vikramasila, and Odantapuri.
The destruction was just unimaginable. Bakhtiyar Khilji, his army, they just leveled Nalanda.
They leveled it.
Yeah, and burned the library, millions of manuscripts all gone. It's like a piece of human history just vanished.
Tragic. It's like not just the buildings destroyed, but a whole system of learning, a way of life wiped out.
And it really changed India's educational landscape. Madrasas, these Islamic schools, they started popping up, and the focus shifted to Islamic teachings. It was a big shift.
So like a whole new chapter started.
Yeah, but it wasn't a complete erasure.
Yeah.
Some of those ancient institutions, they adapted. They became Islamic centers, mixing in Persian and Arabic knowledge, creating this, like, hybrid system.
So there was still that mixing of ideas, even in the midst of all the turmoil.
Definitely. And there were even attempts to bring back that inclusive approach. Akbar, the Mughal emperor, he tried to get Hindus studying in madrasas.
That's interesting, like trying to bridge the divide.
Yeah, sadly, those efforts didn't always last. And then, of course, the British arrives.
Oh yeah, the British. It's a whole other story.
A whole other chapter in India's educational journey, a chapter filled with, well, both progress and some pretty controversial stuff.
So the British basically came in and said, we're going to change how you do things.
Yeah, they had their own vision for education in India. It was all about, like, strengthening their rule, making Indian culture more like British culture, and basically controlling the economy.
So like they wanted to reshape India, starting with the education system.
Exactly. One of their biggest moves was making English the main language of instruction.
So like everyone had to learn in English.
Pretty much. They wanted to create a class of Indians who were comfortable with British culture, who'd act as a go-between for the British rulers and the Indian people.
It kind of makes sense from their perspective, I guess, but it also seems like they were trying to like erase Indian culture and language.
Yeah, it was definitely about control. They thought that teaching Indians in English would make them more accepting of British rule. They wanted Indians to admire British culture, to see British heroes as their own. It was about, like, replacing Indian identity with the British one.
Wow, it's kind of scary how powerful education can be, right?
Yeah, for sure. But the thing is, it didn't quite work out how they planned. Well, by exposing Indians to all these Western ideas, democracy, individual rights, freedom, they accidentally gave them the tools to fight back.
Like they created their own worst enemy.
Exactly. They were so focused on control that they missed a basic truth. Once you let knowledge out, you can't control it. It's like trying to hold back a flood.
That's a great analogy. And it makes total sense when you look at how Indian nationalism took off. Leaders like Gandhi, Nehru, tons of others, they were all products of that British education system. And they used it to dismantle the empire.
Oh, yeah. They used the British's own tools, the language, the laws, the whole idea of democracy to turn the tables.
It's actually pretty genius.
Yeah.
It shows how education, even when it's meant to control people, can become this force for change.
Totally. It all comes back to the power of ideas. You can't contain them forever.
Now, what about the missionaries? They were a big part of all this, weren't they?
Oh, yeah, big time. They saw education as a way to, like, achieve two things at once, spreading Christianity and promoting Western values.
So it was about changing hearts and minds.
Exactly. They set up schools all over India, often targeting the most vulnerable communities, hoping to convert people and bring them into, like, the Western way of thinking.
So their goals were kind of mixed, huh? Religious zeal and cultural, imperialism.
Yeah, and it's tricky. They did some good, like improving literacy and helping women get access to education.
But it sounds like their main goal was to replace traditional Indian knowledge with, like, a Western worldview.
That's the complex part. They believed that Western culture and Christianity were superior. And that, sadly, led to the suppression of a lot of traditional Indian thought.
It seems like this tension between preserving the old ways and adapting to new influences, it's a recurring theme throughout India's education story, isn't it?
You got it. It's been this constant push and pull between holding on to their heritage and embracing new ideas.
It's a reminder that history is never simple. It's always messy and full of contradictions.
Exactly. It's not black and white. There are so many layers, so many perspectives.
Absolutely. And I think understanding those complexities is key to really getting India's educational history. But before we go any further, let's rewind a bit, back to those incredible ancient learning centers. I can't help but feel sad thinking about what was lost when Nalanda and Vikramasila were destroyed.
Yeah, it was a huge loss for India, for the whole world, really.
I mean, Nalanda was like a beacon of knowledge, attracting students from all over. And that library, they say it had millions of manuscripts.
Millions. Imagine the knowledge that just disappeared when those libraries burned. It's just...
I'll break it.
Yeah, it is. It's like a Library of Alexandria moment, you know?
Yeah.
But even with that devastation, the spirit of learning in India, it didn't die.
So how did scholarship survive?
Well, scholars fled to different parts of the country, taking whatever knowledge they could save. New centers of learning popped up, carrying in the torch. It just shows how strong that desire for knowledge is, how people always find a way to keep it alive.
That's pretty inspiring. But how were these ancient universities funded? Was it all government support?
It was actually much more decentralized than you might think. Kings and rulers definitely played a role. They donate land and resources. But communities were also very involved. Temples acted as educational hubs, and individuals would contribute to support both teachers and students.
So it was like a community effort.
Yeah, very much so. It shows how much they valued education.
You mentioned temples as education centers. Can you tell us more about that?
Temples weren't just places of worship. They were like the heart of the community. Many had spaces for learning, and some even became full-blown temple universities.
Yeah.
Libraries, debates, lectures, all happening right there.
Wow. It was like learning was woven into every part of life, even the spiritual side. Was this system open to everyone, or was it just for a select few?
That's one of the amazing things about ancient India's education. It was surprisingly accessible, not just for the elite. They had this concept of bhiksha.
Diksha.
Yeah, it allowed students and teachers to receive food and lodging from anyone in the community. Imagine everyone chipping in to educate the next generation.
That's amazing. It's like crowdfunding for education, but in ancient times.
Exactly. It just shows how important learning was to them. It wasn't seen as something private just for yourself. It was a shared responsibility.
That's a really powerful idea, especially today when education is often seen as a privilege you have to pay for.
It's a different way of thinking about it, for sure.
So we've covered a lot in this first part of our deep dive. We've gone from those incredible ancient universities to the chaos of invasions and the arrival of the British.
It's been quite a journey, right? From those early days of vibrant learning to the challenges and changes that reshaped everything.
And it's amazing to see how, even with all those obstacles, the desire for knowledge in India never went away.
Definitely. It's a testament to their spirit, their resilience.
But before we wrap this up, what's the one thing that stands out to you from everything we've talked about so far?
For me, it's that resilience. They faced so much invasions, destruction, attempts to erase their knowledge. But the pursuit of learning never died. It's truly remarkable.
I agree. It's pretty inspiring. It makes me think about what we can learn from all this. Knowing what we know now about India's educational journey, both the good and the bad, how can we use those lessons to create a better system for the future? A system that's more inclusive, more equitable.
That's a great question, and it's a question for all of us, no matter where we are in the world. As we continue exploring this story, let's keep that question in mind. What can we learn from the past to build a brighter future for education, both in India and globally? You know, it's amazing how that thirst for knowledge in India, it never really went away, even under British rule. They might have been forced into this new system, but they took it, they shaped it, and in the end, they used it to challenge the whole idea of colonial power.
That's where things get really interesting. Remember how the British were so worried about Indian soldiers learning in their own languages?
Yeah.
They thought it would make them less loyal to the empire.
Exactly. They saw education in those regional languages as like a ticking time bomb. They were terrified it would spark all this nationalism, all this resistance, especially within the army.
And it wasn't just about soldiers, right? The British elite, they really believed that if Indians learned English literature, Western thought, they'd start to admire British culture and reject their own. It's like they wanted to create a whole class of Indians who were basically mini Englishmen.
Yeah, it was a calculated move to weaken Indian identity and replace it with a British one. They thought that an English education would make Indians grateful for being ruled, make them see British heroes as their own. They wanted to erase their past, their culture.
But history had other plans, didn't it? The whole system they created, it backfired on them big time.
You could say that.
By teaching Indians about democracy, individual rights, freedom, all these Western concepts, they accidentally gave them the tools to fight back.
Talk about unintended consequences, right? They were so obsessed with control that they forgot something very basic. You can't control knowledge. Once it's out there, it's out there.
It's like a wildfire. You can't contain it. And it makes perfect sense when you look at how Indian nationalism grew. Gandhi, Nehru, so many others, they were all educated in that British system.
They were.
Yeah.
And they took what they learned, they used it brilliantly.
Yeah, they used the language, the laws, the whole idea of democracy to take down the empire from the inside.
It was a masterclass in using your opponent's strengths against them. They showed how flawed the British system was by using the logic the British had taught them.
Now, I'm curious about the missionaries. They played a big role too, right? Especially in those early days of British rule.
Huge role. They saw education as this, like, dual-purpose tool. Convert people to Christianity and instill Western values. Two birds, one stone.
So it was about changing hearts and minds at the same time.
Exactly. They were building schools all over the place, often focusing on the poorest communities. Their hope was to, convert people, bring them into this Western way of thinking.
So their motivations were, well, kind of complicated. A mix of religion and cultural, dominance.
You could say that, and it's a mixed bag. On the one hand, they did help improve literacy rates. They helped get more women access to education.
But their ultimate goal was to replace traditional Indian knowledge with their own worldview.
Right. Yeah, that's the tricky part. They genuinely believed that Western culture and Christianity were the best, the most advanced. And that belief, unfortunately, led to a lot of traditional Indian thought being pushed aside, suppressed.
So this whole reshaping of India's education by the British, it wasn't just about imposing new lessons, was it? It was about fundamentally changing Indian society from the ground up.
And the effects of that are still being felt today. India is still working to decolonize its curriculum, to bring back its traditional knowledge, to make sure education is fair and accessible for everyone. It's a work in progress.
This makes me think. We've talked a lot about how outside forces shaped India's education. But what about things happening within India itself? Were there movements to reform education from within?
Absolutely. The response to those British policies, it was really diverse. Some people embraced the new system, but others pushed back hard. They wanted to go back to traditional ways, or they tried to create this blend, taking the best of both worlds.
That's interesting. So there were people trying to create something new, something uniquely Indian. Can you give us some examples of these reformers?
One of the biggest names, of course, is Gandhi. He was very critical of the British education system. He said it was making Indians strangers to their own culture, creating this elite class that was totally out of touch with the average person.
So he wasn't just fighting for political freedom, he was fighting for a cultural and educational revolution.
Exactly. For Gandhi, it was all connected. He wanted an education system based on Indian values, traditions, something that built character, practical skills, a sense of responsibility to the community. He believed education should empower people to be self-reliant and help uplift everyone around them.
So it was less about producing, like, bureaucrats and more about creating a better society.
Absolutely. His vision was deeply tied to his whole philosophy of nonviolence, self-sufficiency, social justice. He wanted to raise a generation that was smart, ethical, and committed to the greater good.
That's a powerful vision. Were there others who shared similar goals?
Oh yeah, lots of thinkers and reformers were engaging in this conversation about what Indian education should be. For example, Rabindranath Tagore, he started Visva University. His goal was to blend the best of Eastern and Western thought, create a place where different cultures could meet and learn from each other.
It sounds like Tagore was trying to create a truly global university years ahead of his time.
He was, and it wasn't uncommon. A lot of Indian intellectuals at the time, they saw the value in Western knowledge and ideas, but they were also passionate about preserving and reviving India's own intellectual heritage.
Yeah.
They wanted a system that was both deeply rooted in Indian traditions and open to the world.
So it was about finding that balance, that sweet spot between the old and the new, between what was uniquely Indian and what they could learn from other cultures.
And that process of shaping and reshaping is still happening today. The education system in India right now, it's a product of that long, complicated history. It reflects their ancient traditions, the impact of colonialism, and the reforms that came after independence. It's a system that's constantly changing, always trying to keep up with a world that's changing so fast.
It's a testament to how adaptable education can be, how it changes with the times.
It is.
But going back to something you mentioned earlier, about how the British were scared of regional languages fueling nationalism, did those fears actually come true? What role did language play in the fight for independence?
Those fears, they were spot on. Language became this powerful symbol of identity and resistance against the British. Nationalist leaders, they knew that promoting regional languages was key to connecting with people, to building a sense of unity and pride in India's diverse culture.
So language wasn't just about communication, it was about empowerment. It was about taking back their own narrative, their own identity.
Exactly. It was a direct challenge to the British idea of English as the only language that mattered. By promoting their own languages, they were saying, our strength is in our diversity, not in becoming copies of the British.
It's fascinating how something as basic as language can become such a powerful force for change.
Language is more than just words. It carries culture, history, identity. And in colonial India, it became this battleground for who gets to control the story of who Indians were and what their future should be.
Now, shifting gears a bit, I want to talk about something we haven't really touched on yet. Access and equity in education. Before the British arrived, how did access vary between different social groups? Was it really as elitist as people say?
That's a really important question, and it challenges some of the common assumptions we have. It's true that certain groups, especially Brahmins, had a lot of influence in the traditional system, but it wasn't as simple as, like, the elites get educated and everyone else doesn't.
So it's a more nuanced picture than we often
Yeah.
hear.
Definitely. The work of Dharampal, that scholar who studied pre-colonial education, it really sheds light on this. His research shows that a large number of students in those traditional pathshalas, those schools, they weren't Brahmins, they were from other backgrounds, including what we might call lower castes today.
That's a big deal.
Mhm.
It suggests the traditional system was much more inclusive than some people give it credit for. What about gender? Were girls able to get an education in pre-colonial India?
We have to remember that access varied a lot, depending on the region and community. And there were definitely inequalities, with some groups facing more barriers than others. But the evidence we have, it does show that girls weren't completely excluded from education before the British came along.
Really? I always thought that educating women in India was a pretty recent thing, mostly because of the British.
That's a common idea, but it doesn't tell the whole story. The British definitely pushed for female education. They saw it as part of their whole civilizing mission. But girls and women were already learning in pre-colonial India, especially in some places like Kerala, where female literacy was actually pretty high.
So the story of education in pre-colonial India is a lot more complex and interesting than we often hear, right?
Absolutely. It's not a simple story of exclusion and privilege. It's this rich mix of access, opportunity, and cultural values.
And it's important to keep that in mind as we continue to learn about this topic. By questioning what we think we know and looking at things from different angles, we get a much more accurate and a much more fascinating picture of India's educational heritage.
That's exactly it. It's about challenging our own assumptions and being open to different perspectives.
Well, we've covered a lot in this part of our deep dive, haven't we? And we talked about movements for change within India, the power of language, and the whole issue of access and equity in education.
It's been quite the journey.
And it's not over yet.
Not at all.
So before we move on to the next chapter, what are some of the key things that stand out to you from our discussion today?
For me, it's that India's education system has always been this dynamic, ever-changing thing. It's been shaped by forces from outside, but also by debates and reforms happening within India itself, by the dreams and aspirations of its people. It's a story of resilience, of adapting to change, and of constantly pushing for a system that's fair and just for everyone.
It's also a reminder that even when things are tough, people never stop searching for knowledge. It's part of who we are.
It is. It's that human spirit of wanting to know more, to understand the world around us, that keeps us going.
Absolutely. And on that note, I think we need to take a short break to process all this amazing information. But don't go anywhere. When we come back, we're going to dive even deeper. We'll look at some alternative narratives, challenge some common assumptions about India's educational past. It's going to be good. Stay tuned. All right, welcome back to our deep dive. Get ready because we're about to challenge some assumptions about India's educational past and explore some alternative narratives.
You know, one of the most common stories you hear is that India's education system was this exclusive thing only for a select few, mainly Brahmins.
Right, like a VIP club.
Exactly. But as we've seen, the sources tell a much more complex story.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to Dharampal's research. He found that even when the British were saying most Indians were illiterate, there was actually a lot of learning happening at the local level.
His work is so important because it really debunks that myth that education in ancient India was just for the elites. He found evidence that a good chunk of the students in those traditional pathshalas, those schools, were actually from non-Brahmin backgrounds. Some were even from what we'd call lower castes today.
And it wasn't just about caste either, right? Dharampal also found that girls were learning in these pathshalas, especially in places like Kerala, where women were actually pretty literate. It challenges that whole idea that education was only for men back then.
Absolutely. It's important to remember that access wasn't perfectly equal everywhere. There were definitely differences depending on where you lived and what community you were part of. Some groups had more challenges than others. But the evidence does suggest that the traditional system was much more open than it's often portrayed.
So if this traditional system was so widespread, why do we keep hearing this narrative about it being so elitist?
That's a great question. And I think it shows how important it is to understand who's writing history and whose voices are being heard. The British, with their own goals and agendas, they had a reason to portray traditional Indian education as, backwards and limited. It helped them justify their own reforms, their whole idea of bringing civilization to India.
So they were basically spinning the narrative to fit their own needs.
Yeah, you could say that. And unfortunately, that narrative has stuck around, even after independence. It's part of this bigger conversation that often downplays what India has contributed to knowledge throughout history.
It's like they're trying to make people think that Indian culture and knowledge aren't as valuable.
Exactly. So it's important for us to challenge those narratives and really celebrate the richness and diversity of India's intellectual traditions.
Speaking of which, one thing that really impressed me was the sheer amount of knowledge that was being developed in ancient India. It wasn't just about religion and philosophy, it was about math, astronomy, medicine, the arts, everything.
It was a truly holistic approach to learning. The Indian concept of vidya, it encompassed every kind of knowledge, from the spiritual to the practical. And that's reflected in how those ancient universities were structured, like Takshashila and Nalanda.
Yeah, like Takshila, they had courses on all sorts of things: grammar, logic, military strategy, medicine, you name it. They were famous for their surgical skills. Susruta, that ancient surgeon, his techniques were way ahead of their time.
And Nalanda, wow, that was a global center of learning, attracting students from all across Asia. And their library, it was so vast that it took invading armies months to burn it all down.
It's hard to imagine how much knowledge was lost when those invasions happened. It's a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge, it's not always smooth sailing. It can be interrupted, destroyed, even intentionally suppressed.
Absolutely. But it also speaks to how resilient knowledge can be. Even when institutions are destroyed, ideas find a way to survive.
Right.
They travel across borders, get translated, adapt to new environments.
It's a hopeful thought. It's like they say, you can burn books, but you can't burn ideas.
Exactly. Think about how Indian numerals made their way to the West through the Islamic world and became the basis for modern math. Or how Indian astronomy influenced how people in China and other parts of Asia understood the stars. It shows how knowledge connects us all across time and cultures.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what does this all mean for us today? Why should we care about India's educational heritage?
I think there are a few reasons. First, it's about recognizing and reclaiming a history that's often been distorted or ignored. Understanding how rich and complex India's intellectual traditions are, that's essential for building a sense of pride and identity, not just for Indians, but for everyone.
It's about giving India its rightful place in the story of human knowledge.
Exactly. But beyond that, there are lessons we can learn from India's past. The focus on holistic learning, the idea of communities supporting education, the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. These are ideas that are really important today.
Especially when we look at the challenges the world is facing right now: climate change, inequality, all the rapid changes in technology.
Exactly. We need new ways of thinking, new approaches to solve these problems. And looking to traditions that valued critical thinking, ethical behavior, and the interconnectedness of knowledge, well, that can give us some valuable insights.
We've only just scratched the surface of this topic. India's educational heritage. It's this treasure chest of wisdom and inspiration.
It really is. It's a journey worth taking.
Absolutely. And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this incredible deep dive. We hope you learned something new and that it sparked your curiosity to keep exploring.
It's been a pleasure.
And that's it for today. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.